Well, we all knew that Tom had been suffering for the last few years, and there's a sadness, but there's also a light there because Tom represented our childhood, and he was a light that we could all look to. He was the best at his craft. He was the leader of his team. He was immaculate in his preparation and the way he approached his job. He was a good person. He was a tough person. I was fortunate enough to get to know Tom when he was working as a broadcaster for the Mets, and that was one of the great joys of my life, to be able to meet and get to know one of my heroes. Tom arrived with the Mets when I was 9 years old, and you almost took him for granted as a Mets fan because he was so good all the time. But as you think back, he was the one person who changed the entire notion of what it was to be a New York Mets fan. Tom was not like the rest of us mortals. He enjoyed life, man. He did. Every day he approached life with a joy and a smile. He had a great sense of humor. He should be remembered as the greatest Met of all time. He will always be the most iconic figure in the history of the franchise. There's a reason why his nickname was the franchise, because there are no Mets as we know them without Tom Seaver. The history of the Mets is intertwined with the career of Tom Seaver. And when you think about the stroke of luck that it took to make Tom Seaver a Met, that makes the story even more iconic, because they picked his name out of a hat. And imagine if that had never happened. But we're all tremendously fortunate that the Mets slip of paper wound up being picked out of that hat, because we have nothing but the fondest and most joyous memory of George Thomas Seaver.
It's still impossible for me to process right now. It's an hour or whatever it's been that I've gotten the news, and I've talked to a bunch of people, and I feel like I'm talking in circles because I still can't believe it. The brilliance of Tom Seaver was so evident from virtually the moment he stepped on a mound for the first time that every fourth or fifth day, the Mets were championship material. He was so technically proficient that Buddy Harrelson once told me that he could cheat a couple of steps either way at shortstop because he'd know what pitches were coming. He'd peer in, and he would know that if the idea for Tom was to put it knee-high on the outside corner, that the hitter would probably, if he was lucky enough to put the ball in play, would hit it exactly where Tom was expecting Buddy to be based on the pitch that was coming. When I was more deeply involved in the business, I would eventually work with him on air as a partner from time to time, and that was magical. I mean, Todd, you could appreciate this. We were in St. Louis one night. I'm doing a game with Tom, and Tom's in the middle of making a point, and all of a sudden he goes, "Hey, that's a balk." And then you count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Then the umpire called the balk. Tom Seaver, as a broadcaster, would call a balk before the umpire did. And I was sitting right next to him. I saw it with my own eyes. That's how sharp a mind he was.